Funding for the production of Folks is provided in part by the Friends of LPB.
Up front today, a report on one of the nation's top black journalists, Ed Bradley from television's 60 Minutes. Our one-to-one segment features Dr. Asa Hilliard from Georgia State University in Atlanta. He's an authority on many subjects ranging from early childhood education to African-American history. Then it's off to the Museum of Art in New Orleans to take a look at some exciting works from the Harlem Renaissance. I'm Rob Hinton, and we'll have those stories today on Folks.
Everybody says folks, just plain old folks. Everybody just people all over the world. Folks who live, folks got to give, folks got to care, folks got to share. Our world is small, so very small. What touches one of us, who touches us all? To stay alive, just to survive, folks got to be in harmony. Everybody just folks, just plain old folks, just plain old folks. Everybody's just folks, everybody just folks, just plain old folks, just plain old folks. Everybody's just folks.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Folks. Up front today, we're going to share with you some thoughts from one of this country's leading black journalists. He's Ed Bradley from television's 60 Minutes. Now, Bradley recently spoke at a church here in Baton Rouge, and my associate Genevieve Stewart was there. Genevieve?
Rob, Ed Bradley is a 20-year veteran journalist who has covered many exciting stories. While here in Baton Rouge, he candidly expressed opinions on topics ranging from Jesse Jackson to Nicaragua. And the audience seemed anxious to ask questions of the man who was on the other side of the microphone for a change. Bradley began his presentation by making references to his controversial interview with Governor Edwin Edwards and his on-air confrontation with Chicago Mayor Harold Washington.
I'm reminded by that introduction that I seem to have problems with politicians from time to time. One of them being your governor. I would say, though, that Edwin Edwards and I are still friends. I would think Harold Washington and I are, well, I wouldn't say that.
He answered questions on such varied topics as U.S. involvement in Latin America to the press being excluded from the Grenada invasion.
And the American history in Central America is support of right-wing dictatorships. It has always been that way. The last time the Americans intervened in Nicaragua, we sent in the Marines. They stayed there for 20 years. When they left Somoza in power. When he died, his son took over. I mean, so there's been this history of American involvement and the propping up of right-wing dictatorships throughout Latin America. One, as far as Grenada is concerned, I don't see, I can't buy the reason given, and I do not accept the reason given by the administration for keeping journalists out of Grenada. Journalists went ashore at Normandy, at D-Day, and certainly didn't compromise that action. I covered combat in Vietnam and in Cambodia and never compromised any military operation. I don't think there is a journalist who would have gone on that operation who would not have abided by their rules and would have compromised any of those missions.
Bradley addressed a journalist's need for objectivity, even as a black facing the Ku Klux Klan.
I do think, in summation, that it is possible to draw a line and to put your opinions aside and to look at something objectively. I've interviewed the Ku Klux Klan. It was obvious how I feel about the Ku Klux Klan, but I let the man state his viewpoint. I mean, I interviewed a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Okay, what do you have to say? Tell me. And we broadcast it on CBS reports. This is what you believe in? Fine. And there was a question and answer session. And I mean, I'm surrounded by these guys, and I can see the guns under the road. I can see the baseball bats. Okay, fine. I don't believe you're going to do this on national television with that baseball. So I'll sit here and ask you a question. You know, sometimes you're wrong. I didn't believe Harold Washington would do that on national television, but he did.
To the question, should columnist Milton Coleman have reported Jesse Jackson's Jaime remark, Bradley answered.
Let me start first of all with Milton Coleman and the Jaime remarks, which I assume is what you're referring to. I think that what Milton Coleman did was right. I don't think that you have one standard for a black politician and another standard for a white politician. When Earl Butz made his remark, it was reported. He took the heat.
Bradley related two incidents that particularly stood out in his mind, beginning with Dr. Martin Luther King and the evacuation of Vietnam.
I was with Dr. King in his hotel room at 6 o'clock with Dr. King and Reverend Abernathy and Andy Young and a few other people. And someone had just sent out for food, and I looked at Dr. King. He had on a pair of pants and his shirt was off. He had a t-shirt on and no socks. And it was the first, I said, boy, he's human. I was watching him eating spare ribs and collard greens and potato salad, and I said, boy, he really is a spare. You know, I mean, this was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King eating spare ribs and wiping the sauce off, you know. It kind of brought him down to human proportion. It took us 8 hours to get out of Saigon. South Vietnamese Marines, when we arrived at the airport in a bus, shot at us and drove us away from the airport. People attacked us at another place where they said helicopters were going to land. We ended up at the embassy trying to get over the fence. To go a distance, I say, from this podium here to that wall took me an hour. That wall was the wall of the embassy. It took me an hour to fight my way from here to there, to climb over the embassy wall, to get inside. Once inside, another couple of hours to get upstairs to the roof to go out. That would be story number 2.
Bradley had definite views on most topics, but he did seem to hedge at stating firm opinions on issues relating to minorities.
The simple answer is that I am not able to sit here and tell you that Ronald Reagan would be better for minorities or Walter Mondale would be better for minorities. I think that is a decision that you have to make as an individual. And I think you have to weigh carefully not just the personality of the candidates involved, but the programs of the candidates involved and how those programs would impact on one society at large, because as society at large goes, so goes your own individual life. I know that's a complicated answer that doesn't really answer your question, because I get the feeling what you'd like to say is, who's going to be best for minorities? And that's an answer that I can't give.
I think there has been a slowdown in civil rights activities on a broad scale under the Reagan administration. I think that there has been less emphasis on civil rights from a government point of view, because the position of this administration is to get the government out of it and let the private sector do it. My personal opinion is the only reason the private sector did it in the beginning was because the government put pressure on. Now, as far as, well, that answers both your questions, doesn't it? Civil rights and economy?
Yeah, and how the Reagan administration, how its attitude affecting both black businesses.
Well, did I answer that? I didn't answer that satisfactorily.
You think you answered?
I thought I did. Can we have a vote?
During a personal interview with another journalist, Bradley had a defensive reaction to questions about being a minority in journalism.
What about as a minority, a black journalist? Do you feel that some people expect that you would look at things from a different perspective and thereby perhaps exhibit certain prejudices?
Well, that's their problem. That's not my problem, isn't it?
I would imagine it is. But do you ever get indications of that from people as you go out to do stories?
Not really.
How do you think a minority journalist should serve in his capacity as a journalist?
You're not serving as a minority journalist. You're serving as a journalist. So you serve in the way any other journalist serves. I mean, how does a female journalist serve? How does an Indian journalist? How does a Hispanic journalist serve? How does a black journalist serve? How does a white journalist serve? I mean, is there a dividing line? And there are different rules for different people? I don't think so.
Being the subject of a personal interview was obviously a difficult experience for Bradley, who was ready to end it abruptly.
I'd rather ask the questions and answer them.
Why?
Because that's what I'm paid to do. It's how I make my living.
You feel then rather at ease being asked questions?
No?
Are there any particular questions that you would prefer avoiding or evading if you were asked?
Ask them and I'll avoid them.
Is that what Ed Bradley does best during an interview? Of Ed Bradley?
I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know.
Well, I'll leave that. I'll tell you what. I'll leave that decision to you and to your audience.
In all fairness to Ed Bradley, he also hedged on another topic which many of us try to avoid.
I would think that most people my age and older, and I'm 42. Now, I just had a birthday and I forget. I'm 43.
Rob Bradley's almost hostile reaction to a personal interview was very interesting.
Good report, Genevieve. It's time now for our one-to-one segment, which today features a man who might not be well known to you, but who is very popular on the convention circuit. His name is Asa Hilliard, a professor at Georgia State University in Atlanta. Now, he's an authority on subjects ranging from education to African-American history. We were first introduced to him at the Black Family Summit in Nashville, Tennessee last spring. We met up with him again at a convention for black nurses in New Orleans. Hilliard has written many articles on subjects such as testing and evaluation, cultural pluralism in education, child development, and African-American history.
We began in the Nile Valley, somewhere around a lake called Lake Nyanza. You now call it Lake Victoria. We developed for millions of years around the Nile Valley. As a matter of fact, for the first 4 million years of humanoid existence on the face of the earth, there was nothing but Africans. There were no people anywhere else in the world. And after about 4 million years, there was a spread of people to the rest of the world, and then you begin to get population in China. Then, for about 500,000 years, we developed again in the Nile Valley and began to creep down that valley from the middle of Africa, somewhere near the equator, until we produced, at the end of that river, 4,000 miles away, the first civilization that the world has ever known.
Dr. Hilliard, you said in your address that in order for blacks to know where they're going, they need to know where they have been. Do you think that there is an apathy among blacks to learn more about their history?
Well, I think that the opportunities are not presented. When they're presented, there's a hunger. It's almost the opposite. There's a real hunger among black people to know these things. But 12 years of public school, nothing. 12 years of those same years in movies and on television, nothing. And frequently, even in our own institutions, we're so overburdened with our other priorities that we don't take the opportunity to teach the things that they need to know. So I've found that wherever the information is provided, there's just an enthusiastic response to that from black people, and it's to the extent that apathy exists, it's mainly an apathy of the absence of information.
Hilliard told this audience of black nurses that blacks are conditioned to think of themselves as minorities when there are more people of color in the world than there are whites.
We are not a minority in the world. In fact, we are almost a majority in the world. We only think of ourselves as a minority because we forgot who we are and we don't know how to recognize our people. That's right. There are 60 million of us in Brazil. There are whole numbers of millions of us in the Caribbean. That's why it's so interesting to national government.
We lose the information about who black people are and where they are because so many black people have been renamed. And so a West Indian, in most cases, is a black person. Many of the people who are Hispanics are black. They're of African descent. You know, for example, in Honduras and El Salvador and Nicaragua, places like that. In Mexico, you know, large percentages of people who are Hispanic Mexicans are black. There are Chinese today who are black Chinese. There are Russians today who are black. So there are those little pockets. But even beyond that, in the Pacific Islands, you know, you got Fiji, Papua New Guinea, and then when you get to the continent itself, and when you add up all the black people in the world, you get a number that will be shocking. You know, it's approaching the number of Chinese in the world. And there's certainly more than 500 million. And I would not be surprised if you did a careful study to see something approaching something closer to 750 million black people in the world.
Hilliard speaks out on many issues that affect black Americans. One of them is standardized tests.
The test to control the flow of graduates to get out of high school, biased tests that say your children will never even graduate, so they won't even have a chance to try to get into colleges. The tests that are barriers to college admissions for tests such as the Scholastic Aptitude Test and the American College Test Program. As a matter of fact, we've done some studies on these tests, and we find that black students that have 100 points less than white students will get in school and earn the same grade that those white students earn from white teachers. So the tests don't work the same way for black people that they do for white folks.
You appear to have a very dim view of standardized tests. Can you tell us why?
There are ways to use tests that are positive, but for the uses that most people make of tests, especially with respect to things like entrance requirements to tests to determine whether a person gets a chance to try school, that when those tests are used with black people, they falsely say that many blacks are unable to master a college curriculum. And they say it falsely because we know that many blacks who get low scores can go in with nothing, and nothing more than those scores, and do quite well with academic grades. And that even those who don't have the initial basic skills can be given those skills within a very short period of time. So that we get a false picture of what blacks can do by giving them these universal standardized tests. And they're so much a fact of life in schools from kindergarten all the way through the university, and they act as hurdles and barriers rather than as things to help us learn what we need to do in order to help students to do better. There's no reason why 90% of the black students who graduate from high school shouldn't be fully capable of doing calculus. But frequently, the way tests are used in schools track students into experiences that will guarantee that they will never approach mathematics at that level. A foreign language, the same thing.
And as has been the case with many other black leaders and speakers, Hilliard sharply criticizes the Reagan administration.
During the time that we've been in the United States of America, we have never known good days. We have known better days, but we have never known good days. We are not now knowing good days. If anything, we're on our way back to something worse than anything that we've ever had before.
Whatever statistic President Reagan looks at, he would have to be an actor to say that with a straight face, that to say that blacks are better off today than they were 10 years ago would have to be a complete misstatement of fact. The number, there's just a congressional report just released yesterday that showed that the number of blacks who have slipped into poverty has grown. Something like 500,000 new families were pushed into, black families were pushed into poverty just as a result of Reagan's budget cuts. That does not count the number of people who were pushed into poverty just because of the poor economy. In other words, there are two things that push us into poverty. One is that the economy is down, depression or recession. But over and beyond that, there were a whole host of black people that were being supported on federal programs, and when those were cut, so there was at least 500,000 people, independent of the economy, who were pushed into poverty since Reagan has been in office. There's no way that anyone can say that and really be truthful.
Dr. Hilliard, can you give us your opinion on how you feel blacks can best utilize their talents?
Well, a combination of things. I think that a prime priority for Black Americans now is to rebuild the cultural base that will permit us to operate in a more unified fashion. You know, that we have a sense of we-ness and a sense of peoplehood. And I see that as a prerequisite to almost everything else, because when individual blacks are confused about who they are and whether they belong and whether they have an obligation or a responsibility to anyone other than themselves, then all the other efforts, economic and political, are doomed to failure. So you can't have appropriate political participation when people are confused about where their loyalties are. And we see a lot of that today among many people who are quite prominent among blacks, but they're prominent as individuals. And some of them will come out and say, as was the case, for example, Vanessa Williams said that at the beginning. She didn't see that there was a whole lot that connected her to black people. You know, she was just almost a black person by accident. And there are others who say that, you know, as well. And that's, if they feel that way, they're entitled to that opinion. But I'm just saying that if that's typical of growing numbers of black people, then the capacity for unified action is completely destroyed.
And if you ever get a chance to hear Dr. Hilliard speak, check him out. I guarantee you won't be bored. We are now going to take you to the New Orleans Museum of Art and share with you an explosion of black creativity that began back in the 1920s. A turning point for many black artists, a period known as the Harlem Renaissance.
Well, the Harlem Renaissance began in New York City right after the First World War, around 1920. And it was a time of great creative excitement and really an explosion of talent that occurred in New York City, in Harlem. Writers, painters, photographers, musicians, all coming together to create really an authentic expression of black experience and black life in America in a way that it had never been fully expressed before. Very much inspired by some of the leaders of the black community that had emerged during that period. And what they really told the artists was that we need you to come up with an artistic expression that talks about our own life and our experience in America, and not just a kind of academic expression that one would find in the standard art academies. Well, the leader of the Harlem Renaissance in the visual arts was Aaron Douglas, who was a painter and a printmaker. And he was the inspiration from a whole group of painters who gathered in Harlem at the time, and then other younger artists of later generations that came to New York or were working in other parts of the country. Other artists from that time would be Hale Woodruff, Malvina Johnson, a number of painters and sculptors and printmakers. This exhibit is special first because it's all drawn from one collection. This comes from the Aaron Douglas collection, which is a collection of paintings and sculptures, several hundred works, which belongs now to the Amistad Research Center here in New Orleans. And it's probably the most, certainly one of the largest collections of work of black artists in America. And the idea was to develop a series of small exhibitions which are going to be circulated to museums throughout the South. So this is the first showing of this exhibition, and then it will be toured for about 2 years by the Southern Arts Federation. It's also the first opportunity that we've had here to present a historical survey of the development of black expression in the visual arts in the 20th century. We begin with the work of two of the late 19th century pioneers, Mr. Tanner and Mr. Bannister, Edwin Bannister, and I've forgotten his first name, Tanner's work, who both of them trained in an academic situation. Tanner was at the Pennsylvania Academy and tended to stay within the confines of the general established artistic styles of the period. Looking at their work, you would not know if they were black or white artists. But they were important role models for the later artists after the turn of the century. And then we have, that's sort of the introduction to the exhibit. Then the central part of the exhibit are the actual artists of the Harlem Renaissance, particular Aaron Douglas. And we have 3 of his paintings and several of his woodblock prints. And then we have the next section are younger artists who were very much inspired by the Harlem Renaissance artists and who have, since the Second World War, achieved considerable fame in the United States.
Some really extraordinary works. Next week on Folks, Genevieve will be talking one-to-one to Sybil Taylor, the highest-ranking woman in Louisiana's labor movement. And I'll have a report on a group of senior citizens who are angry over the rising cost of health care. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Funding for the production of Folks is provided in part by the Friends of LPB.